Have you ever wondered what part of who you are was born with you, and what part was built by society? Have you ever wondered what part of who you are was born with you, and what part was built by society? It is a very interesting question. It summarizes what in psychology is known as the dichotomy between the innate and the acquired. It is a classic debate between supporters of nature versus nurture. This debate tries to resolve what part of our behavior is genetically determined, and which one depends on having developed you in a certain environment, how different we would be as people, and how your organism with the same genetic and epigenetic load would be if it had been raised in an environment completely different. For example, would you be just as intelligent? Would you have the same morality? Would you have a similar personality? These questions are not new, they are questions that philosophers first, researchers later, have been studying for many years with different approaches. Much of that research is based on the study of twins, but that would give for another video. There is an approach that would yield relevant data. It is a cruel approach for the experimental subjects. In psychology it is known as the forbidden experiment. Imagine that you want to find out which part of a human's behavior is genetically determined and which one depends on his history of interaction with the environment. One thing you could do is go to the moment when he begins to interact with the environment from birth or even earlier, because in the womb you are also interacting with the environment and depriving it of any interaction, to see what capacities are developed and not realized. Now do you understand why it is called forbidden? Because it would involve using babies and isolating them completely. In this hypothetical experiment, you would have to give a minimum of life support to the babies so that they do not die. You would have to feed them, wash them, give them heat, etc. This implies a minimum of interaction with the environment, but it would be the minimum that the organism needs to stay alive. Starting from that basic minimum, one could choose to increase or decrease, according to convenience, the degree of interaction with the environment. You could have children alive, but deprived of sensory stimuli, and keep them without light, without sounds, without smells, or tastes, etc., and see what kind of human being comes out of it. You could have children exposed to a normal environment, but without social contact, or children exposed to social contact but not to a language, or exposed to everything, except certain cultural elements. You could touch variables that would give us a lot of information, and the results are very interesting, but however you look at it, it is a cruel experiment for those human beings and therefore prohibited. But reality sometimes surpasses fiction and is cruel, much more than we can sometimes imagine. In 1970, the real known case that most closely approximated the forbidden experiment came to light. It is about Genie and one of the most famous nicknames in psychology. In California, in 1970, an almost blind woman entered a social services office, with a girl who at first glance seemed to be about 6 years old, with a strange appearance and gait. The workers of the center immediately realized that something was wrong with that girl. It turned out that she was not 6, if not 13, but she barely weighed 27 kilos, and did not reach 40 meters in height. Her behavior was completely strange. Social service workers began investigating to see what had happened to that girl. Genie was born on April 18, 1957. He lived with her parents and her older brother, John, who was, along with her, the survivor of a total of 4 births. The marriage, formed by Irene and Clark Wiley, suffered from frequent disagreements. Irene suffered from progressive blindness due to cataracts and a detached retina. Clark, for his part, who was 20 years older than Irene, suffered from an aggravated depressive picture that was triggered by a traffic accident in which his mother died, and was a man who frequently beat up his wife. He also suffered from a congenital hip dislocation that forced her to wear a splint on that part of her body. Genie started talking at 20 months. A family doctor suggested that the girl had a learning disability and that she possibly also had an intellectual disability. Clark took this situation to the extreme, coming to believe that the authorities would take her daughter away from her, or that she would be taken to a specialized institution, and that it was her duty to provide her with domestic treatment and protect her from the dangers of violence. Outside world. It turned out that Genie had been unlucky enough to grow up in an abusive home. The girl's father was a violent man, and ironically obsessed with protecting her family. The mother, on the other hand, was a submissive woman with little character. This subject was convinced that her daughter had some degree of mental retardation and determined, if she did not isolate her from the world would eat her. Her solution was creepy. When Genie was barely 2 years old, he led her to one of the bedrooms of the house they lived in, tied her to a urinal and decided that he would leave her there as long as she could. The torment lasted until she was 13. By order of her father, they provided her with the minimum of care and the minimum of attention. When she was not tied to that chamber pot, she was tied in a sack and lying in a crib. She could not move more than feet and hands. The room was dark, only a crack allowed the light to pass through, and the house lived almost completely silent, since her father did not tolerate noise. Genie sitting there, she barely heard any sound. Throughout the days she was fed only porridge, cereals, and the occasional egg. Her father forced her to feed her in a hurry to keep contact with her to a minimum. He was convinced that the girl would die and did not want her mother to become fond of her. She barely left anything to entertain herself in that dark and empty room. Sometimes they allowed her to fondle something in the house. Her father sometimes left him the television guide with many of her photos cut out of her. Genie's sensory world was practically limited to that for all those years. The family was forbidden to speak. His only contact with language was the little he heard from the other members of the family or the father's screams when he got angry. To further derision, if Genie had the bad luck to make a noise, his father he beat and, according to some reports, barked at him. This is how her entire childhood passed until she was 13 years old, when her mother, the almost blind woman, finally had the strength to elope with her. It is said that Genie is the girl who has starred in the closest reality to a forbidden experiment. Genie's is a case within the so-called feral children. Children who have grown up outside of a normal social environment, this girl's being the record in terms of deprivation time. Genie barely had sensory stimulation. She spent most of her childhood immobilized, until she was rescued, and most importantly, no one provided him with attachment or tried to teach him a language. There have been other cases of feral children, usually raised by animals, especially wolves, but also by bears, monkeys, or gazelles. But those cases are from 1700, 1800, etc., and it is suspected that it would actually be a fraud mounted on real cases of autism, or for financial purposes. Genie's is the case that is best documented. It was not the perfect forbidden experiment, but without a doubt, it is the real case that comes closest to it. Due to this, doctors and psychologists could not help wondering what this girl was capable of doing and not doing, what her capacities were after being in that deplorable state until she was 13 years old. The most complete report available is the thesis published by Dr. Susan Curtis. This doctor had the privilege of being able to work with this girl during the years after her rescue, and as soon as she met her she could verify that this girl had not passed through the normal developmental milestones expected of a child his age. Even though he was 13 years old, Genie could not walk completely straight, could not stretch his legs or arms, was incontinent, could not chew, salivated a lot, spat. Without decorum he did not seem to be able to focus his eyes on distant things, that gave him a primitive appearance. Despite her ordeal, she seemed to want to know the world. She was vivid, curious, and tirelessly explored all the places where they took her. In the social field there were striking things. Genie sought human contact, she even violated personal space. At first she did not seem to distinguish with her behavior between acquaintances and strangers, often not even between people and things. She approached people who called her attention. If they had something that she liked, she tried to grab it without further ado. There were no social rules for her, but this did not prevent her from establishing links with the caregivers and professionals who worked with her. Luckily, her attachment capacity had not been broken. But Genie had a habit that turned them on their heads. The girl had begun to develop her sexuality in that isolation, without a society that set limits for her with rules of conduct. For this reason, she sometimes self-stimulated her genitals without decorum and in public. Sometimes he even tried to get other people to participate, even strangers. She also collects various objects to give herself pleasure. According to Susan Curtis, it was something that made it difficult to take her out. Her management of her emotions was also curious. She did not vocalize or make noise when crying, probably due to the repression of the sound that her father imposed on her. When she got angry she didn't scream, but turned into a silent ball of rage that she spat out, scratched and injured herself. She passed some psychological tests to know the degree of her cognitive development, and these placed her at the same level as children between 2 and 5 years of age, despite the fact that she was 13. Fortunately, as soon as they started working with her, this level grew little by little. But the language, without a doubt, was the most surprising thing about Genie and the most studied. When they discovered her Genie seemed to know how to say little with her high-pitched voice, single words, and some pseudo-phrase, such as stop or no more, a sad linguistic testimony of her abduction. The girl she knew when she was spoken to, she knew how to recognize the human voice, but she did not understand its content. She knew some names like rabbit or mother and some colors. She knew when to say no, and when someone asked her something because of her intonation, even if she did not understand the content of the question, they had to communicate with her through gestures. Most of the time, psychologists, when encountering such a great delay in language acquisition, saw a unique opportunity to test a series of questions about this human capacity. Was there something in our brains from birth that gives us a kind of proto-language, despite not being exposed to one? Or are all elements of language a cultural creation? Is there a critical period for acquiring the ability to communicate through language? Or is it something you don't have date of expiry? Susan Curtis and other professionals set out to teach Genie English. But what was it they were able to achieve? One of the conclusions of Curtis's thesis after years of work trying to teach him the language answers this question directly. Genie's language is far from normal, but despite the abnormalities in the most fundamental and critical aspects, Genie it has language. But what were these abnormalities? They were not few. For starters, some tests indicated that language in Genie's brain was where it was not expected. Language is one of the cognitive functions that in most people is lateralized in the left hemisphere, but in Genie's case it was in the right. It seems as if the lack of linguistic stimulation in childhood had caused this left side to lose interest, and when the time came to learn the language it developed where it could no longer reach its full splendor as a cognitive function. When they began to work with her, the first thing she began to acquire was vocabulary. She learned new words with relative ease. She was good at combining sign with concept, words with things. The problem began to arrive with grammar and syntax, that is, in other words, by giving it a regular structure. Genie's sentences were often chaotic and often incomprehensible. Even though Curtis constantly tried to fix those chaotic constructions, Genie never handled English grammar correctly. It was as if the girl had invented her own rules for the language, and it was impossible for her to abandon it. She spoke Genie English, she had improved, but she never managed to learn what was her mother tongue. The Genie case is not the perfect forbidden experiment, as she was not only isolated and deprived but also abused. We cannot discern if the deficiencies in his development were due to the lack of environmental stimulation, factors such as malnutrition or abuse, or if he suffered some type of basic disability. Therefore, the conclusions that the professionals who worked with it they are scarce. The Genie case is generally accepted as a support for the hypothesis of the existence of a critical period for acquiring the ability to communicate through language, a period during childhood, outside of which it is difficult to internalize the rules later to start using a first language. Regarding the internalization of social rules, Genie made great strides after her rescue, and managed to adapt to a more or less normal life, but her cognitive development was below average. Little more is known about her life. Her luck left him again. Her mother tried to regain custody and prevented Susan Curtis and other professionals from continuing to work with the girl. Genie's advances stalled and the tracking of her life stopped. Her mother died, and for privacy little else is known. Some sources indicate that today she is still alive and cared for in a residence in the United States. Genie was not the perfect forbidden experiment, but it is a case that speaks in favor of how indispensable it is to have a full childhood to shape the human being. It also raises infinite questions. What would we be like as a species if we had not developed language? If instead of by spoken language we communicate exclusively by other means, or we do not communicate at all, how would our thinking and therefore our history as a species be?